In the fall of 1880, a newly elected sheriff rode into the freezing New Mexico desert with a group of Texas cowboys and one simple order from cattle king John Chisholm: clean out that squad east of Sumner. 6 months later, that sheriff would use a confiscated outlaw's revolver to kill the most wanted man in the American West, one shot in a pitch-black bedroom. The bullet punched through Billy the Kid's chest and ended a legend that Hollywood would spend the next 140 years trying to resurrect. But here's what almost nobody talks about. That Colt revolver Pat Garrett carried into Pete Maxwell's ranch wasn't just any six-shooter. It was a specific configuration of weapon that made it significantly more dangerous than the standard revolvers most lawmen and cowboys carried on the frontier, and Garrett didn't even buy it. He took it off a member of Billy's own gang. The story of how that gun ended up in Garrett's hand, what made it so lethal, and the insane 140-year journey it took from a frozen standoff in New Mexico to a $6 million auction in Los Angeles is one of the strangest tales in firearms history. To understand why this particular revolver mattered, we need to go back to a freezing morning at a place called Stinking Springs. December 23, 1880. Pat Garrett had only been sheriff-elect for about 7 weeks. His term had not even officially started yet. But cattle rancher John Chisholm was tired of Billy the Kid and his gang terrorizing Lincoln County, and Garrett was the man he had put his money on to end it. Garrett gathered a posse of tough Texas cowboys and tracked the Kid's gang to a small rock house near a dried-up spring in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that smelled exactly like its name suggested. Before dawn, Garrett's men surrounded the building in the dark. They waited in the freezing cold, rifles trained on the door. When the first figure stepped outside at sunrise, the posse opened fire. They thought it was Billy the Kid. It was not. It was Charlie Beaudry, one of Billy's closest friends. Beaudry stumbled back inside with fatal wounds and died shortly after. Garrett's men had already killed another gang member, Tom Folliard, a few days earlier back in Fort Sumner. With 2 of his friends dead and no way out, Billy the Kid did something he rarely did. He surrendered. Out came the Kid, along with Dave Rudabaugh, Tom Pickett, and a man named Billy Wilson. And this is where the gun enters the story. When the gang surrendered their weapons, Garrett helped himself to Billy Wilson's personal firearms, a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver. This was standard practice for frontier lawmen. You catch an outlaw, you keep his guns. Think of it as an unofficial bonus. But Wilson's Colt was not just any revolver. It was a Colt single-action army, chambered for the .44-40 Winchester center fire cartridge with a full 7.5-inch barrel. Its serial number was 55093, and it was manufactured in 1880. To understand why this specific gun was more dangerous than what most people carried on the frontier, you need to understand the cartridge it fired and why that barrel length mattered. The .44-40 Winchester was introduced in 1873, the same year Colt released the single-action army. Winchester designed it for their Model 1873 lever-action rifle, the gun that would eventually earn the nickname the gun that won the West. The standard load pushed a 200-grain, flat-nosed lead bullet at around 1,245 feet per second out of a rifle barrel. That is a heavy, wide projectile moving with real authority. For context, most rimfire cartridges of the era were significantly less powerful. The .44-40 could take down deer, coyotes, and even black bear at close range. It was considered a genuine man-stopper. But here is what made the .44-40 truly revolutionary on the frontier. Colt started chambering their single-action army in .44-40 starting in 1877, and they gave it a special name, the Colt Frontier 6-shooter. It was the only caliber variant of the single-action army to get its own dedicated name, etched right into the barrel. The reason was purely practical. If you owned a Winchester Model 1873 rifle and a Colt Frontier 6-shooter, both chambered in .44-40, you only needed to carry one type of ammunition, the same cartridge in your rifle and your revolver. On the frontier, where the nearest general store might be 100 miles away and a resupply could take weeks, that was not a convenience. It was a survival advantage. One belt of ammunition could feed both your long gun and your sidearm. If your rifle ran dry in a fight, your revolver still had rounds. If you found ammunition on a dead man or bought some at a trading post, it worked in both weapons. This was the kind of practical edge that could literally keep you alive. Now, about that 7.5-inch barrel on Garrett's confiscated Colt. The single-action Army came in 3 standard barrel lengths. The 4 3/4 inch was popular with civilians who wanted something compact and easy to draw. The 5.5-inch was a solid middle ground, but the 7.5-inch was the original cavalry length, designed for the United States Army. That extra barrel length did 2 important things. First, it gave the shooter a longer sight radius, which made the gun easier to aim accurately at distance. The Army specified this length because they wanted soldiers who could hit targets, including enemy horses, at ranges up to 100 yards. That is a tall order for a handgun, but with a 7.5-inch barrel and proper technique, it was genuinely achievable. Second, the longer barrel gave the burning black powder more time to accelerate the bullet before it left the muzzle. In practical terms, you would pick up roughly 50 to 100 feet per second of additional velocity compared to the shorter barrels. That might not sound like much on paper, but with a 200 grain lead projectile, every bit of extra speed translates into deeper penetration and a flatter trajectory. And here is the detail that makes the 4440 particularly nasty at close range. That 200 grain bullet was a flat nose design, not a pointed or rounded bullet. Flat nosed lead bullets do not slip through tissue cleanly the way a pointed bullet might. They crush and tear. At the velocities the 4440 produced, especially from a longer barrel, the wound channel was devastating. The bullet would typically produce exit wounds at caliber size or larger, and the internal damage was catastrophic. So when Pat Garrett walked into Pete Maxwell's dark bedroom on the night of July 14, 1881, he was not carrying a typical frontier sidearm. He was carrying a military-length Colt loaded with one of the most effective man-killing cartridges available in the American West. It was a combination of barrel length, caliber, and bullet design that made it about as lethal as a handgun could possibly be in 1881. He used it at a range of maybe 10 feet. The story of that night has been told 1,000 different ways in books, movies, and songs. But the basic facts are these. Garrett had tracked Billy the Kid to Fort Sumner after the kid's famous escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse, where he had killed 2 deputies and fled in chains he somehow managed to remove. For months, the kid had been hiding out near Fort Sumner, visiting friends and a woman he was involved with. On the night of July 14th, Garrett went to the home of Pete Maxwell, a local rancher and mutual acquaintance. He sat on the edge of Maxwell's bed in a darkened room, asking questions about the kid's whereabouts. That's when Billy walked in. The kid had been at a nearby house and wandered over to Maxwell's, possibly to cut some meat from a side of beef hanging on the porch. He was barefoot, in his shirt sleeves, carrying a butcher knife. When he noticed unfamiliar figures on the porch, Garrett's deputies Poe and McKinney, he backed into Maxwell's bedroom and asked in Spanish, "Quién es?" He could see a figure sitting on the bed in the darkness, but he didn't know it was Garrett. Garrett recognized the kid's voice. He drew the confiscated Colt, Billy Wilson's 4440 Colt single-action Army with a 7.5-inch barrel, and fired. The bullet struck Billy just above the heart, tearing through the ventricles. At that range, with that cartridge, death would have been nearly instantaneous. Billy managed to fire 1 shot from his own revolver, a self-cocking pistol, but the round went wide and lodged in the wall above Maxwell's bed. Garrett fired a 2nd shot that missed, but it didn't matter. Billy the Kid was already dead. The coroner's jury found that Garrett had acted in the discharge of his official duty and ruled the killing justifiable. And that should have been the end of the story. The sheriff killed the outlaw, the law prevailed, justice was served, but it wasn't the end. Not for the gun, and not for Garrett. What happened to that Colt revolver over the next 140 years reads like a plot from a novel that an editor would reject for being too unbelievable. Garrett kept Billy Wilson's Colt for decades after the killing. He carried it as his personal sidearm, which tells you something about how much he valued the weapon. This wasn't a trophy he locked in a case, it was his working gun. Around 1904, Garrett lent the famous pistol to his friend Tom Powers, who ran the Coney Island Saloon in El Paso, Texas. Powers collected Old West memorabilia and displayed the gun behind his bar alongside other firearms connected to famous frontier figures. Then, in 1915, something happened that would change the trajectory of the gun's fame forever. A newspaper reporter named Walter Noble Burns was covering the Pancho Villa raid in Columbus, New Mexico, and he stopped by the Coney Island Saloon. He noticed the old revolver behind the bar and asked about it. The bartender casually told him it was the gun that killed Billy the Kid. Burns went on to write The Saga of Billy the Kid, published in 1926, which single-handedly reignited America's fascination with the outlaw. Suddenly, the Kid was not just a dead criminal from the territorial days. He was a romantic figure, a rebel, a folk hero, and the gun that killed him became the most famous revolver in the American West. Meanwhile, Tom Powers shot himself in the heart in 1930. Amazingly, he survived for 3 months before dying in 1931. After his death, the gun sat in his estate, tangled up in legal disputes. That's when Garrett's widow stepped in. Apollinaria Garrett, Pat's second wife, who had married him in 1880 and given him 8 children, sued the Powers estate to get the revolver back. The legal battle dragged through the Texas courts for years. In 1934, the Texas Supreme Court sided with Apollinaria and ruled the gun legally belonged to her. She eventually sold it to a collector in Texas. It passed through a few more hands over the decades until Jim and Teresa Earl, noted collectors of Western memorabilia, acquired it in 1983. Notarized statements from Garrett's own son, Jarvis, verified each transfer. Then on August 27, 2021, at a Bonham's auction house in Los Angeles, the Colt Single Action Army revolver, serial number 55093, the gun Pat Garrett used to kill Billy the Kid, sold for $6,030,313. It shattered the world auction record for any civilian firearm. The pre-auction estimate had been $2 million to $3 million. The final price more than doubled that. The same auction sold Billy the Kid's own double-barrel shotgun, the one he used to kill the deputy during his courthouse escape, for nearly $1 million. John Wesley Hardin's revolver went for over $600,000, but Garrett's confiscated Colt dwarfed them all. A gun that started its life as an outlaw's sidearm, confiscated during a freezing standoff at a place called Stinking Springs, became the most expensive civilian firearm ever sold at auction. $6 million for a gun that Pat Garrett took off a man named Billy Wilson, who most people have never even heard of. But the story of this revolver gets even darker when you consider what happened to the man who wielded it. After killing Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett expected to be celebrated. Instead, the people of Lincoln County turned on him. Writers quickly churned out books and articles that turned the kid into a folk hero and painted Garrett as an assassin who shot an unarmed man in the dark. Garrett lost his next election for sheriff. He spent the following decades ranching near Roswell, serving as sheriff of Donna Ana County and briefly working as a customs collector in El Paso, a position he received from President Theodore Roosevelt. But that federal job ended in embarrassment when Garrett brought his gambling buddy Tom Powers to a lunch with the president, passing him off as a cattleman. The press found out. Roosevelt was furious, and Garrett lost the appointment. By 1908, Garrett was 57 years old, deeply in debt, and trying to sell his ranch in the Oregon Mountains outside Las Cruces, New Mexico. A cowboy named Wayne Brazel had leased part of the property and filled it with goats, which infuriated Garrett. On the morning of February 29, 1908, Garrett set out by buggy with a man named Carl Adamson, heading to Las Cruces to finalize a sale. Along the road, they encountered Brazel on horseback. What happened next remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Old West. Garrett stopped the buggy about 5 miles outside of town. According to the official account, he stepped down to relieve himself on the side of the road. That's when the shots came. 2 bullets hit Garrett. One struck the back of his head, the other hit him in the stomach. The man who had killed Billy the Kid died on a dusty road while urinating, shot from angles that made self-defense nearly impossible to believe. Brazel walked into the Dona Ana County Sheriff's office and confessed. He claimed Garrett had threatened him and reached for a shotgun, and that he had fired in self-defense. Carl Adamson, the only witness, backed up the story. The trial did not happen for over a year. When it finally went before a jury in April 1909, the prosecution barely tried. Adamson was never called to testify. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes and acquitted Brazel. Almost nobody believed Brazel acted alone. The man had no criminal history, no reputation for violence, and no obvious motive for murder. Historians have spent over a century building the case that the real killer was James P. Killer Jim Miller, a notorious gun for hire whose cousin just happened to be Carl Adamson, the witness. The conspiracy theory goes like this: a group of powerful ranchers and political figures who had grudges against Garrett met at the St. Regis Hotel in El Paso to plan the assassination. They allegedly paid Miller to do the actual shooting. Brazel's job was to provoke Garrett with the goats. Adamson's job was to make sure Garrett showed up at the right place at the right time. Miller himself was lynched by a mob in Oklahoma just hours before Brazel's acquittal, reportedly after confessing to multiple murders. He never stood trial for Garrett's killing. Brazel married, bought a small ranch near Lordsburg, and then simply vanished from the historical record. Some accounts say he was killed in Bolivia around 1915. Nobody knows for certain. The man who killed Billy the Kid was himself killed in a manner that Billy would have recognized. Ambushed, shot without a fair chance, killed by someone who may not have even pulled the trigger. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I cover the real stories behind legendary weapons and the people who use them every week. Now there is one more layer to this story that brings everything full circle. Remember the gun itself, that 4440 Colt with a 7.5-inch barrel. The reason Garrett's revolver is considered the most important Western firearm in existence is not just because it killed Billy the Kid. It is because the weapon represents the exact moment when the mythology of the American West began to crystallize. Before Garrett pulled that trigger in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, Billy the Kid was just another outlaw. A dangerous one, sure. He had been convicted of murder, escaped custody, killed deputies, but he was a regional figure in a territorial dispute that most Americans had never heard of. It was the gun and the killing that transformed him into a legend. Within months, writers were producing books about the kid. Within years, the story had spread across the country. Within decades, Cecil B. DeMille was making films about it. Aaron Copland wrote an opera. Sam Peckinpah turned it into one of the greatest westerns ever filmed. And through all of that retelling, all that mythology, the actual physical object that made it happen, a Colt single-action Army revolver confiscated from an outlaw named Billy Wilson during a freezing standoff in the New Mexico desert, sat behind a bar in El Paso, then in a widow's hands, then in a collector's safe, waiting to be recognized for what it was, a 200-grain flat-nosed bullet pushed by 40 grains of black powder through a 7.5-inch steel barrel in a dark room from 10 feet away. That's all it took to create the most enduring myth in American frontier history. And the gun that did it, it is still out there, somewhere in a private collection. Serial number 55093, the most dangerous, most storied, most expensive civilian firearm ever sold. That's the real Pat Garrett pistol, and it was way more dangerous than anyone ever knew. If you want to see how another legendary weapon changed the course of history, that video is on screen now.